Welcome everyone to the 2020 Great Game of Business Conference. So excited to have the founders of this great game movement, Jack Stack and Bo Burlingham, here today. My name is Darren Dahl. I worked with Jack on his most recent book, Change the Game. And we're just excited to be here today to talk about this journey, the great game journey we've all been on over the past, well, in Jack and Bo's case, more than 30 years. We're going to have a conversation between the three of us, and we look forward to getting your feedback after about what you think, what your takeaways were from this conversation.
Let me take exception to that. I don't consider myself one of the founders of this movement because, the great game of business was happening, and what my role was just that I noticed it, and I became aware of it. But it was really what was going on at SRC. Back then, it was just one company. It was what we now call heavy duty, but back then it was just Springfield Remanufacturing Corp. And it was sort of Jack who made us at Inc. I was at Inc. magazine. I was the executive editor of Inc. magazine. And one of the things that we did at Inc. was that we had an annual survey of compensation. And we sent it out to sort of a random group of subscribers. I mean, we didn't really have any method for selecting them. We just sort of.
Do you remember what year that was, Bo?
Yep, that would have been 1985.
Jack, I mean, Inc. magazine's kind of played a really important role in a lot of different ways, I think, for you and for SRC. I mean, so like, I can't imagine today maybe that you're gonna take the time to apply to a survey for a magazine, but you did for Inc. Can you maybe just explain like what did Inc. mean to you, and why did you feel the need to fill out that survey?
Well, I would have to, it's very hard for me to really understand why I did it at that exact moment. But basically, when I do something, I'm usually because I'm pissed off at something, and then I respond to it. It wasn't the fact that I was supporting a cause here or trying to. It's just that I felt that there was a lot of controversy at that time. I think somebody named Galen, somebody was writing about the equalization of salaries. And I think the issue was that we've got to be able to compress the salaries of the top management. So there's a ratio between the average number of pays compared to, someone said that CEO should be about 10 to 1 to the average. And I think Ben and Jerry's had a piece of this, and there was a lot of push that too much money was raising to the top, and there had to be some kind of equalization between top management and the average wage of the entire workforce. Okay, so that was, I think, at the issue at the time. And I just thought, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, okay, because a lot of these guys were saying that their salaries were compressed to meet this ratio. So I think I responded to the compensation program saying, I think there's a middle of the road here between the excesses of a CEO and the average wage of everybody. And there's a compression that we could all agree upon. And the institution will last for a long period of time, and we could build something of sustainability. So that's probably, I always kind of get motivated when I see something out there and maybe I don't fully understand it. And so I kind of take a negative aspect to it and I try to dig into it a little bit deeper.
Basically, I think a lot of people read the turnaround story and they became aware of SRC and they became aware of what you were doing at SRC. And it began, and because really it was after that the whole social venture network began to form. It was a couple of years after the turnaround article. I remember I was I was sort of wondering what was going on with you guys. And I called you up, Jack, and you and I had never spoken before. And I don't think you knew who I was. So I introduced myself and I said, I asked what's going on. Well, you told me the story about losing that big General Motors contract because of Ross Perot, and how that was going to be devastating to part of your company, and that it looked like you were going to have to do layoffs, but then some of the more experienced people came to you and said, look, we don't have to lay anybody off. We can show these guys what to do. And we can get through this. And I thought, gee, what a great story that is. Why don't we do a column about that? And Joey Kahn came out to, I think he came out to Springfield to work with you and to develop a column on that. And then it was after that, then you and I sort of stayed in touch. Oh, and then the next thing that happened was that we were having a Inc. 500 event coming up. And it was in Cleveland, I believe. And I talked to George Gendron, who was the editor-in-chief of Inc., and various other people, and we all agreed that it was really, we would really like to have you at that conference doing a session if you were willing to. And I think Ben and Jerry were going to be like keynote speakers or something like that. And so you said sure, that you'd be willing to do it. So we invited you to that Inc. 500 conference. And what happened there, well, that's where you met Ben and Jerry. I know that they knew about you and you knew about them. And so it was like I don't think you'd ever met them before. And they immediately recognized you as sort of a kindred spirit. And then I remember you were doing a breakout session. And it started out, and you were talking about the great game of business. And we'd never had this at our Inc. 500 events before. And I remember going to look at it and seeing what the turnout was. And in the beginning, it wasn't that big. And I then went off and checked some of the other sessions. And then I came back, and the room had entirely filled up. And in fact, there were people outside the door as you were explaining about what this great game of business was. And it turned out to be a very, very popular session, although a lot of people thought you were crazy, frankly. I would say most people thought you were crazy.
That hasn't changed.
And I remember saying to you afterwards, the editorial group was going to get together to have lunch. And I remember asking you, would you like to have lunch with us? So you came and had lunch. And I remember you took a seat, and next to you was Harriet Rubin, who was a publisher and very close to the magazine. She was a publisher at Random House. She had her own imprint called Currency Books. And I was on the other side of Harriet. And we were talking, and I remember asking you then, I remember saying, we had a really, really big response at the magazine to the article. And I was curious as to what response you had gotten. And you told me all kinds of things, like being invited to Parliament. And you had people beginning to show up at SRC, wanting to see these meetings that we'd written about in the turnaround. And I remember our talking about that, and I said, well, that was really of all the articles we'd written since I'd been at Inc. magazine, I said that one was really my favorite. And Harriet leaned over and said, well, then you should write this book. And I said, well, I don't know if I can. I mean, but at that point, it was clear she wanted a book about all of this. And she understood that there was something going on here that was really interesting and different and important.
Let me go back to, your statement that you don't feel like you were a founder. Okay, so let me rewind for a second here, because I've been holding back a few things. My reaction is this was the interesting aspect of my life was like East meets Midwest. Okay, because I had never been to the East Coast. I've been born and raised in the Midwest, and the Midwest has certain philosophies and kind of like more of a cowboyish naivety, willing to try anything. And the East is so proper. I mean, you guys were Princeton, your Wharton, your Ivy League, your credentials, and it was amazing for me to leave this little Midwestern community and go to Boston, Cambridge, New York, all these unbelievable places, okay, where people were a little bit different than we were. Okay, it was fascinating to you kind of was you were you really educated us immensely in terms of this entire process. Okay, I mean, you're one of the few business journalists, I believe, that I had ever met that really went after truth and accuracy, and you really picked up on something, and you had this insatiable appetite to find more about it. And the more that you learned, the more interesting it became, and the more interesting it became from you. You have no idea what that responsibility then was transferred to us, okay? Because of what you and the people at Inc. and Currency did to take this one little idea in a small garage shop in Springfield, Missouri, and put it on the front cover of a national magazine, and all of a sudden start a movement, okay?
I will say this, is that I take full credit for recognizing that there was something going on here, but it was something that you guys had, and I mean, for me, it was incredibly educational. I mean, you were my teacher, Jack. I mean, you had a whole way of looking at business that was two things. It was new to me, and it was also tremendously satisfying, because it really was an attempt to make business better, to make running a business a more human enterprise.
Let me interrupt you for a second,
Sure.
because it's a really important point here. And it's something that probably needs to be said now more than ever. I think you are underscoring the power of journalism and the power that it really has. And you didn't know at that time you were using that power to make business better. I mean, this is something that we really need so badly today. Journalism is nowhere where it was when you guys were writing Inc. magazine, okay?
Totally agree with
I
you.
mean, you wrote a magazine for a cause. You had a purpose in terms of what you were doing, and you sought solutions in order to be able to make it better, okay? And your integrity, your honesty, and your desire to learn more about it, okay, is what really made this whole movement better.
But you did tell me that that my interviewing you felt like going to the dentist.
I'll tell you one thing. I felt a 1 hour interview with you was like being in a dentist chair for 3.5 hours. I think that I'd just like to take a moment to, we're talking about it, it's a great game, we're talking about a system. but it was really what we're talking about was the evolution of an idea. Okay.
Mhm.
And like any idea that you really try to, really explain to everybody what it is, there's a lot of negativity. We talked a lot about, the negativity on the part of a publisher, the negativity on the part of a marketer, and negativity on the part of a people. In fact, even Jolene, I remember giving a speech, got up there and said, why do you white males always have to use sports as an analogy to be able to get anything across that you get, why do we use the game? And I was stunned. I mean, she just stood up in the middle of hundreds of people and took my pants down, right? And the only thing I could say is, well, Jolene, what am I supposed to do to explain this idea? Was I supposed to use gardening? Are the weeds going to attack the carrots? And how do I said, all I'm trying to do is explain an idea. I'm not trying to solve all the social problems. And our life has been, defending this idea.
Well, there was, it's sort of crazy to think about it now, but there was a big debate as to whether or not competition was good or bad. And,
Absolutely.
And should you have competition internally in a company, or and that became a very big. There was a guy, unfortunately, I can't remember his name right now, but he actually wrote a book about this. He had an article about it, and it's saying that basically competition was bad.
Oh, I remember you reading that and being furious.
Yeah.
And I think you really ripped something off too somewhere,
I don't know.
But I don't think too many. I don't think we study an evolution of an idea, and what creates its sustainability. And this had an interesting mix in terms of bringing it to where it has been today. To be able to have an audience like we have out there that. They probably really don't realize that for 38 years, we probably had almost every single question of why you shouldn't do this, okay? And what could go wrong with this? And how many times in our lives have we heard the same question asked over and over again? If this is so great, how come so many people don't want to do it? And I think that just, again, I don't think that everybody realized that this was so many people, because of whether they were positive or because they were negative, all right, that we still tried to work the idea, that we still felt that at the end of the day, it isn't the fact that something couldn't come along that would be better, but we could build on something here that could make a significant difference in the lives of so many people. And I think that's something that, again, you got to be so proud of being part of. And you got to realize that it wasn't as easy as maybe somebody might think it is. And, how many countless number of nights did you get a question from the audience? I mean, I remember one of the questions that somebody once asked me in one of the presentations said, isn't this communism?
Yeah,
I mean, another one of those questions where you're just stunned out of your mind saying, I don't know whether this is socialism or communism or,
I remember getting that. The argument about why doesn't everybody do this if it's so great, which comes up a lot, still comes up a lot. And the answer that I've sort of come up with is, well, of course, the people who are doing it are happy that not everybody is doing it.
Yeah, right.
Because, God forbid their competitors were going to start doing this. I mean, and then I always say, just think about it. If you have two companies doing the exact same thing in the exact same market, and in one of these companies, there are 4 or 5 people at the top who know what's going on, and there are, 95 people behind them, beneath them, who are sort of waiting to be told what to do, and they're competing against a company where there are 100 people who know what's going on and who are coming up with ideas about what to do, who's going to be more successful? It's like not, it's like, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. If you have 100 people, well, it goes back to one of your higher laws, Jack. It's easy to stop one guy, but it's hard to stop 100.
A couple of years ago, we were asked to do an interview for a national magazine, and it was a reporter out of the East, and very well polished, very smart, a writer, and he spent several days with us, really intense. And I'd never forget the fact I dropped him off at the Doubleday. I think it was a Doubleday. And before he got out of the car, and I said, you're screwed for life. And the guy looked at me and goes, what are you talking about? I'm screwed for life. I said, well, once you understand this, you'll never look at business differently again in your entire life. How has this thing affected or changed you two? All right. How has it changed your thinking? Because this idea does change people and the way they look at business and the way they behave in business and the way they act in business, and they act differently in business. So can we just spend a couple moments, saying that, how did this one idea affect you, change you, either for the better or for the worse?
So Darren, you want to take that?
Well, I think you should start, but I think this is a great question because, it makes me think back, the story you were telling, Bo, about all these journalists that you were sending to Springfield. And I can't even imagine how many journalists Jack has talked to over the years. And it's one of these complaints: do journalists really understand business? Or what? But Jack has always been this teacher to me as well. I know you said that for you personally, and I think that this system, this great game, it's impossible not to be changed once you see its impact. And again, I would love to hear more, like what the first time you went to Springfield, but I think for me it was such a monumental thing, because one of the first times I came to Springfield was right after you guys went 100% employee owned, or the ESOP owned the whole company. And I went and interviewed people across all the plants and asked them about like what it meant to be an owner now. And I think that was the first time that, you can read about this system and it sounds like really radical and wow, mini games and transparency and all that stuff. But then when you actually see people who live it on a daily basis and get emotional about it and see how positively it impacts them and gives them, a sense of hope and optimism and control, that's when you're screwed. It's like, oh my God, this isn't just a normal thing anymore. This is people's lives are being changed because you're arming them with a whole new way of looking at the world.
Aren't you giving them the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's beyond the truth, because it's also, you're giving them the tools to change their future. It's not being a victim anymore, or, you've taken out the us and the them that exists in so many companies. Like, there's, who are you going to complain to? It's balls in your court to change things.
Yeah, I would say that the way it's affected me really has to do with how I now look at other companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so many companies get into trouble because of communications inside the companies, and because all the things, rumors and misunderstandings. It's rare. I know that when one of the first things that a lot of companies do is that they try to make, when they decide they're going to get into the game, one of the first things they do is to try and get employees to understand about the money. And employees, over and over again, I hear how employees think that your sales are what you take home. And that when you actually go through the process, actually have them go through the process of taking the sales and then using it to pay all the costs, plus the taxes, which they're shocked by, of the business, that, you know, with many businesses, it's lucky if you have sort of 1% to 3% left. And it becomes a, you know, a shocking revelation. And to that extent, when I see other businesses, well, it's like, you know, Jack, I keep thinking about what you told me about the conference that you went to at the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay. And about
you're talking more recently,
more recently, and how you were really the only one who was preparing for a recession. I mean, that's sort of built into the game, the way you play it. And you were at that point, you know, building up had your goal of having $100 million in cash. I mean, there was no sign of a recession at that point, but people were talking about, well, what are you going to do when we hit a recession? And I remember you told me that one person got up and said, look, we're all going to do the same thing except for Jack, because Jack is the only one. We're going to have to lay people off and, you know, cut our costs. And Jack is the only one who's really prepared for it and who actually will be able to sort of take advantage of a recession and, you know, to grow the company and to change the company. And, you know, I've since we've gotten into this, you know, the current COVID recession, I've often thought about and wondered what's happened with those companies. Have they, I mean, you know, given the level of unemployment, I've got to believe that a lot of them have, in fact, you know, wound up just laying off a lot of people.
I thought it was interesting to set up on that. First of all, the lady didn't really say Jack. She just said, because she just said there was one person
Okay.
was prepared for the, you know, the point that she was responding to was the top companies in America were there, and they were all seeking what new idea, what was there one new idea that's really come out in terms of leadership over the last 100 years? And everyone made different types of attempts at trying to explain an idea, you know, self-management, and, you know, there's a whole genre of attempts at doing things differently. But at the end of this thing, this 90-year-old guy got up there, okay, and said, I've been here for like 3 days, and I'll tell you one thing, I'm still listening for that one new idea, okay? And I've been around a long time, and the only idea that, to me, that makes any sense is that until you get an emotional intimacy with the people in your organization, okay, there will be nothing new. And you are moving further and further away from your people than you are getting closer to them. At which time the lady got up and said, he's right. You know, there really isn't been one new idea. And then when things go bad, we will revert back to what we know what to do. We will downsize. We will lay people off. We will shrink the business. and the cycle will go on and on and on. And it seems to be a constantly repetitive cycle. And that's, I mean, at the end of the day, the thing that the idea behind the whole great game is really the stake in the outcome, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. I mean, it's getting to what the outcome is. And I think in our journey, what has been interesting is all the different periods of time, there has been different stakes in the outcome. Okay. I mean, I remember the cultural change, the dot-com era, where they weren't millennials at that time. They were kids coming out of college, and they rewrote the book on options and instant gratification and, cash and burn and, gambling on the dot-com companies. Okay. And their stake was relatively short. I remember going to MIT, and I had been there countless number of times, doing a course in the summertime. And the 60 CEOs, I said, how many are you there to build sustainable companies? And 3 out of this, or 4 out of the 60 raised their hand. They go, look, what are you, crazy? I'm here to flip it. Okay. I mean, their stake in the outcome was that they were going to find some treasure chest out in Florida. They're going to cash in the treasure chest, and they're going to put their feet in the sand. And that was their whole conceptual idea of a stake in the outcome. And then we just progressed to, different stakes in the outcome. People on publicly held companies have instantly quarterly reports. They have to live to the moments in terms of what they have. When there are this idea is the 100-year-old company. Okay, how do you build loyalty? How do you build security? How do you build? And ironically, what it comes down to, which we all know, is education. And we've used each other for these last 30 years to just push our own education in the hopes that we can learn new things in order to be able to teach people that there is a stake in the outcome, okay, that's beneficial to everybody in our society. And we just got to teach people, I mean, what that is and how to be able to achieve it. Those were the steps that were outlined in all the Inc. articles and all the books that both of you guys have written in terms of getting to a better place. And
but Jack, I've just been thinking, SRC couldn't have done what you've been doing for the last 10 years in terms of building up this enormous cash reserve if you were a public company, because you would have had.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, you would have had people breathing down your neck saying, you've got to put these resources to work right now.
In fact, it affected our appraisal.
Yeah.
Our appraiser said that he felt that cash should be distributed back to the people and not put it in a reserve for a catastrophe or for a rainy day. Okay. The fact is that there was no interest. It was secured. It wasn't making any money. Capital wasn't being used appropriately. And so we think that, we should then increase the value of the company as a result of it, and not look at it as a protection, as an insurance policy, as an umbrella for a rainy day. Yeah, the logic is really, we don't realize that we all want the same outcome, okay? But we don't understand all the constraints and the interferences that we have in order to get there. And illiteracy is probably the biggest one that we have.
Jack, I think a lot of what's happened with this, and particularly your role in it, has been the kind of responsibility that you feel toward everybody else who's in the organization with you. I mean, we once talked about it, and the thing that struck me was, you're a very unusual CEO in that you don't regard yourself as a CEO. You regard yourself as somebody in the company who's another employee of the company who happens to be the CEO, as opposed to being the leader, and then there are all these followers. I don't think that you really look at it that way. That
I think here's how I get off the hook. Okay. And I really do believe that it's about building a system on making work better. And
Yeah.
I think the idea has evolved into a system, okay? And you keep working a system. You just don't work an organization chart. You don't have the upward mobility. You have more of a mobility that goes sideways as it builds more institutions and companies. We don't have the labor grades where you're killing someone to be an 8 to a 9 to a 10. We're saying that you create a new company, you create a greater size in the company, you can create better opportunities because we're working towards a system, okay? I still come back to that lesson that Deming kept drilling into our heads, is that the Achilles heels of the leadership system in America is that 9 times out of 10 you get a problem, you shoot the person, but 9 times out of 10 you got a systems problem, okay? Well, for a long time, I thought he was saying quality was a systems problem, and he was wrong. I was wrong. It was the great game is the system. Okay, I mean, for us to be able to compete globally, for us to be able to be sustainable over a long period of time, we need to do all these right things. Okay, everybody's got to do things for the right reasons, the right purposes, and everybody's got to understand how they make a difference in terms of everybody's lives. And if in fact something goes wrong, then work on that variance and deviation. And it's not really up for a boss to be able to correct. It should be a self-correcting process to everybody inside the organization. Because if you correct that process, you're going to see the benefits and the rewards of the business and the ownership stake that you have inside the company. The stake in the outcome here is a little bit different than in most people, where it does address instant gratification that drives the long-term success of the organization, so people can have the desires they have and they can picture the kind of business that they really want to be in. So I don't believe in a CEO or a charismatic leader. Okay, I'm sorry. I believe in a system and I just like to work the system.
Yeah.
I wish I had a system.
Can
I
I
wish I
jump
had a
in?
system for horses. I wish I had a system for gambling. I wish I had a system, but I got a system for business, and it's exciting.
Well, you've just been, I think it is really fascinating that the key role that stake in the outcome plays, and it's also pretty fascinating that just happens to be the name of the second book you guys wrote together. That book maybe I think it's becoming increasingly popular these days, but it didn't get the same kind of reaction that The Great Game of Business did. I'm curious, I mean, I know there's a really great backstory between you guys almost killing yourselves writing the book.
Killing each other.
Yeah. So maybe people might like to know a little bit more about, like, why was the second book harder to write than the first?
Well, Stake in the Outcome is a story. It's a narrative, and a lot of what we wrote about in A Stake in the Outcome was happening right as we were writing it. When we did The Great Game of Business, Jack had figured out all this stuff. There's nothing in The Great Game of Business. He'd already worked this out in his own mind. And that went back to his time at International Harvester at Melrose Park, and his figuring out how to motivate people there, and also when he came down to SRC, and he was the general manager of the Renew Center, which was owned by International Harvester, and then through SRC. These were all things that he was working out and that he figured out. When we wrote A Stake in the Outcome, the business was becoming more complicated, and Jack was figuring it out as he went along. I mean, when I first met Jack, he was a plant manager, and he had his office at SRC and at what we now call heavy duty. And you know, I would come in and I would see him there, and he was what he did. The company had to go through an evolution, and it wasn't a simple evolution. It had to diversify. I mean, and Jack recognized that for the sake of the jobs and protecting the jobs, it needed to diversify because it couldn't have everybody working in an area that if it got into trouble, and they'd all be out of work. It had to have other parts of the business that were going to do better at other parts of the business cycle. And he and
Yeah, Dan Rourke.
yeah, well, that was, yeah, but I mean, you and Mike and
Dave.
Dennis was involved, but you got together to do Engines, what was called Engines Plus. And Engines Plus started out as a simple idea, which is we've got this part that we're paying a lot of money for at heavy duty. We could make this ourselves and save a lot of money doing it. And so you and a bunch of the other senior people at SRC got together and said, you know, we'll start a company that see if it can make this part. And you hired Eric Paulson, who was going to be, in effect, the entrepreneur behind this company. And the things started to happen with Eric that happened in entrepreneurial companies. He got creative. I remember that he needed to have a very hot oven to create this.
Heat treat.
Yeah. And he got a pizza oven. And he did a lot of things, and you were supporting him. And lo and behold, Engines Plus succeeded in sort of making this part, I forget what part it was.
Oil cooler.
An oil cooler that succeeded in making oil coolers that were in fact of good quality and less expensive for SRC than what you would have to buy on the market. And that was the beginning. I mean, yes, you had automotive, but to me, Engines Plus was the real beginning of the diversification. And that the other thing that was happening at the same time was Jack was going from being a plant manager to being the CEO of a company. I mean, Danny Meyer of Union Square Hospitality Group in New York has talked to me about how he went from being a restaurateur, in other words, somebody who had restaurants, to being the CEO of a company. And that is a transition because, in fact, thinking as a CEO, you have to think more broadly, and you have to have a much wider view and a much longer term view than being a plant manager. And Jack, you know, a lot of people can't make that transition. And there was a lot of books and, you know, Harvard Business Review articles and things like that about why was it that entrepreneurs couldn't really become managers of their companies. And in fact, that wasn't always true. I mean, and Jack was one of them who was demonstrating that he, in fact, was able to go through this change. And it was happening while we were writing A Stake in the Outcome. And so at the time, Jack was sort of figuring out what was going on. And there was a problem. I mean, one of the things that happened was that Jack was no longer running heavy duty. Dan Rourke, who used to be, back in the day, Jack's boss, had taken over heavy duty. And heavy duty was doing very well, and it was really sort of carrying the whole company. And this sort of this idea developed among the heavy duty managers that, you know, we're the real SRC. These other companies that you're starting, there were a bunch of them, like Engines Plus, they're there to support us. And Jack was basically saying to Dan Rourke, Dan, you're totally dependent on Navistar right now. You have to diversify. And Dan didn't, was resistant. He thought that Jack was paranoid about,
He was right.
Navistar, and that in fact Navistar wasn't. There was no danger. There was nothing happening that would lead you to believe that Navistar was going to go anywhere. He did. Jack would push him and push him and push him, and he eventually did come up with an idea, which was to do agricultural equipment, remanufacture agricultural equipment for John Deere, which again led to another new business, namely Regen. And Dan became this CEO of that too. But what Jack was doing, Jack was being a CEO. Jack was looking ahead, and he was right. Obviously the history since then, we know for sure that Jack's concern about being so dependent on Navistar was eventually going to become a weakness, and it did. It happened later.
Let me take a crack at answering your question on the why it wasn't so successful at the time. When you get an editor that basically starts out by telling you, he says that typically the second business of a business book doesn't necessarily sell well, it doesn't really start the foundation off on a right foot. Okay. All right. Seriously. I mean, they said that historically, second book is a flop. Okay.
Right.
So that's not a really, you shouldn't tell anybody that. Okay.
Right.
Bo is right. We were making it up as we went along. Okay. And we had reached a point where all of a sudden we realized that we needed to figure an out. We did not have an out. That this thing could come and be so outrageously successful, we would not be able to pay the liabilities on the equity we were developing inside the company. Yes, we were tremendously paranoid. For $1 worth of profit that you had, you owe $9 on an evaluation process. Okay, 9 times. I mean, just think about how difficult that math is to work with, and it wears on you. Okay. And so it was wearing on me during that particular point of time that I began to realize that the only way that we could really, really maximize it was to parallel process the company, is organically grow and at the earnings that we had, but also build companies with the idea that we can spin them off and we can sell them. All right. That there was this 9 times multiple, that you could create a business.
Well, and just to pause you, I mean, just to be clear, what you're saying is that because you were employee owned, that the valuation of the company, and so when people retired, you needed to have the money to pay those people off.
Yeah, it was skyrocketing, right? And the very fortunate is that we weren't at a real critical age, which we are today, but at that particular point in time, we were figuring it out. And what comes along is this story between Dan and myself, which is the story that Bo really, really latched onto. Okay. He just thought the dynamics of that story was so important. And he was looking at it from the standpoint of the change between a plant manager. You know, it's like me taking Tim from a general manager, now making him an executive VP. He comes in and goes, what does an executive VP really do? Okay, now he knows what an executive VP does, and it's totally different than making stuff that you can see every day. All right. And so Bo is going down the avenue. I'm going down the avenue and saying, fuck you, Dan. Okay, I'll sell you, you know. I mean, I really believe that I've got to be able to figure out how to generate more revenues, even though you are doing phenomenal milking the cow. Okay, and my fear was that if that cow got drained because we weren't putting it in engineering, you know, we weren't taking risks, all right. And Dan was a tremendous person that could go in there and just tweak every single dollar and every single penny and every did it. All the people in the factory was getting maximized bonus programs, and man, he was hitting the game like you wouldn't believe. It was turned on in every cylinder, but you knew that eventually the cow was going to run out of milk, okay? And there was no trapdoors in Dan's mind. He didn't want to waste any money on contingencies and trapdoors. And Dan didn't really even worry about how to get out. You know, all he did was lived in that instant world, that short-term results-oriented, publicly held company. It's only, you know, be concerned with the quarter. I'm trying to figure out is that, man, what if we build this thing and now Bo's got all the eyes of the world on us, and we fail, you know, what they're going to tell you is that the system is bad because we eat our young, okay? So there's like two different interests in terms of this book going on at the same time. So we struggled with, you know, he wants to know all the details of Carlisle and what do they say and what do they do. And, you know, there was a drama where we actually just we met at a restaurant and Rourke and I cried about, you know, what was the right thing to do. And Bo captures all the, you know, Dan finally sitting there going, look, I ran the gamut of understanding what it took to buy a company. It took me and Marty to go through there and say, you know, these guys that are buying me, I'm not going to get it as much as if I stay here. And you know, it was a fascinating story. It was truly a lot there that we tried to put into the book. Okay.
Yeah,
and
it was also, it started, actually, if you think about it, the beginning of that book was the meeting where you always said it was Steve Shadwick who raised the question. He denies that it was him.
Okay.
But he raised the question where here you were educating everybody about where the profits were going and everything, and you know, it had to buy equipment and everything, and somebody, Steve Shadwick or somebody, said, wait a minute, you know, we're all about the same age here, and we're gonna get to a point, and well, what are we going to do with our stock? He said, I can't eat crankshafts.
Right.
And at least that's the way Jack recounted the story to me.
It was the message. It was, you know, all the values in the inventories, all the value is in the brick and mortar. You know, where is this multiple going to pay itself off? You know, who's addressing the multiple? Okay, you guys are all interested in putting the crankshaft in the engine, selling it, booking the profits, giving us a bonus program, but you're giving us this paper. This paper is really becoming valuable now. Now, how do I cash it out, right?
And this is actually a problem that every ESOP company has. And nobody really, very few people talk about it before, you know, you sort of discover it once you become an ESOP, that you have this contingent liability, which is the need to pay off this stock that people have when they leave. And Jack, I think what was happening was that Jack and SRC was inventing a new way to deal with this. Most people, most ESOPs don't deal with it this way. They either build up a cash reserve or they get to a certain point and they sell the company. And that's where the shareholders get their money. This idea that Jack and SRC were pursuing of creating these spin-offs, these other companies that at some point would allow them to generate a lot of cash. And they were learning about this at the same time that we were doing the book. I mean, Jack, and I don't know if Dan was involved or Jack, but Dennis was certainly involved. When they wound up doing a deal with John Deere, they put in a clause that would allow them to sell their interest to John Deere under certain circumstances. And as a result of that, they were able to sell Regen right before the beginning of the Great Recession. So you went into the Great Recession with cash. And then after that, you developed this other plan, which was let's build up cash as we go along, and then we'll be ready for the next recession.
Well, also, we were also building a war chest to pay off all those retirees that were going to cash out their stock. It was a combination of both. I mean, it was, you're absolutely right. We figured it out as we were going, and we did enter into that joint venture with an exit strategy. It's kind of like we wanted to figure out how to get out before we got in, okay? And we created the joint ventures then in order to be able to build the liquidity, to have another source of revenue, to be able to pay that multiple gap that we had as we were playing the game, all right? So our stake in the outcome, even to this day, is like 5 and 10 years down. That's why we have this high involvement planning piece as part of the, the great game of business, is because we got to be worrying about 10 years from now when the stock price is at X and, they'll be cashing out at taking 20% of their value, and the balance will be over a 5-year period of time. And we got to make certain that we got that kind of liquidity to be able to make certain that we're walking the talk and we're covering the bets,
Yeah, the other thing that was happening was, this to a large extent happened afterwards, after we came out with the stake in the outcome. And that is that the game itself, as it was being played at SRC, was evolving. To me, when I first began to really understand what had happened with the sales meetings, I mean, it wasn't that you didn't have sales meetings, but they became a lot more structured, and there were a lot more expectations about what people were going to bring to the sales meeting. And that was really way beyond what I had understood when I was involved and working with Jack on books. This was happening afterwards. I mean, A Stake in the Outcome came out in around 2000. Great Game of Business came out in 1992. From 2000 on, there was a lot of growth in the way that Great Game of Business was being played at SRC. And of course, the other thing that was happening was that the Great Game of Business, the subsidiary of SRC Holdings, called the Great Game of Business, that was evolving too. I mean, I had been involved in the 1990s, when that was just sort of getting up and running, and there was a lot of trial and error that went on with it before. It was really after it was when Rich Armstrong and Steve Baker really were involved with it, and that they eventually developed a consulting business that really worked. And before that happened, we'd been through a number of attempts at setting up a consulting business that didn't work.
Well, I think that the evolution again. I do think that in the year 2000, the point of staking the outcome was another one of the big steps in terms of the movement itself. And now we're here today, and the game is still strong, but it seems to me with all the conflicts and protests and questions that people have in our society today, it seems like we need it probably now more than ever. Okay, I mean, how do you change the game? I mean, you too, myself, have so many friends that have put it in. We have so many associates, and we built, and just all the people that are out here in the audience today, okay, that we have developed just admiration for. And we've seen it work so many times. What's your current impressions about it as we are today, and where it is, and how it's going, and what we really need to do to convince more people that changing the game is the way we got to look at it.
And I just think, to me, it's so needed right now, if it can be, if everyone participates in it in the way they do the conference. I mean, we didn't really talk about that, but you actually kicked off the first conference, right? Wasn't that part of it? I mean, and it was was it in Springfield?
Well, yeah, the way it started, I remember it very clearly. George Gendron and I and Jack were at the lake house, and Jack was telling us about the response that he'd gotten. It must have been after the book came out. The response that he was getting to that, in terms of people showing up, and there was a lot of interest in this, and there were a lot of companies that were thinking about. I mean, I always thought that, well, this we get off on a tangent, and I remember asking him, do you ever find out what these people do with it once they read the book, and then they come here and they check you out and they see your meetings? When they go back to their companies, what do they do with it? And the fact is that at that point we didn't know. And I think the three of us talked about, wouldn't it be interesting to find out about that? And Jack, I remember that you said, well, let me talk to Gary Brown about it, because I think Gary was in charge of the great game business at that point. And then you told me afterwards that after you talked to him, that Gary and the people he was working with, that they were up for it. They thought that was a good idea. And so that led to our sending out an invitation to have people come to Springfield. It was at, which hotel was that? It was, I don't know what it is now.
I know where it was at. It was on Glenstone, and I remember.
Yeah, right on Glenstone.
Prime Trucking now has bought it and turned it into another hotel, but it was a name of, it was a hotel of the past. Okay.
Yeah.
It really was. All right.
Yeah. And, we had, I don't know how many people we had, probably 40 or 50 or 60.
I'm not sure.
Like that. And one of the questions was, and, we just sort of really we were getting it together just to hear what people were doing and to sort of talk to each other. And at the end, people were asked, should we do this again?
Mm.
And the overwhelming response was, yes, absolutely, you have to do it again. But don't do it in Springfield. It's too hard to reach.
Yeah, that's right.
So when we did the second one, we made sure it was in St. Louis, which is a little easier to reach. And that's where we were for many years, until, well, the one that we on 9/11 was going to be in Palm Springs. That's why I was going to be on a plane to Los Angeles.
Well, maybe just remind folks about what happened, why you you didn't
Jack,
end up flying.
I was at my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My daughter was there, and her then boyfriend, now her husband, were there with us. And I had gone out for my morning run, and I came back, and Kate, my daughter, and Matt, her husband, were excited. They said, do you see what's going on? And I said, no, I have no idea what's going on. And they were looking at the television, and there was planes flying into the World Trade Center. And I thought, wow, that's clearly not a good thing. That's a bad thing. And then Jack called me up. You were in Las Vegas, Jack.
I was on my way to Palm Springs, and I got a speech to the tuxedo retailers of America, and
In Las Vegas.
In Las Vegas, and it was a speech I was going to make before the gathering or the conference, and I think it was that reason you changed your flight.
Well,
because I'd be a day later or something like that.
Yeah, what had happened was that I had originally planned to go out on that Tuesday, 9/11. And then as we got closer to the date, I realized I really didn't have to be out there that early. I could go out on Wednesday and it would be fine. And so when this started to happen, actually it was Jack who called me up and said, was that your flight? And I said, what do you mean, was that my flight? And you said, they say it's coming from Boston. And, we were all just trying to figure out what was going on. And I said, oh, wow. I don't know. I had assumed that it had come from New York. And Jack said, no, they're saying it came from Boston. And so, I don't know, we hung up, and then I called up. Lisa was in France. I was supposed to go, we had a house in France, and I was supposed to go to the gathering and then meet her in France. And so I called her in France, and I got an answering machine, and I said, you better go to a television and watch what's going on, because something big is happening. And then after Jack called me, she called me, and Lisa called me and said, do you know what's going on? No, she said, we were talking about what was happening, and that these planes, and that they were saying that these planes came from Boston. And Kate, our daughter, in the kitchen was yelling out to me and said, they say it's a United flight. And I was on American. And I said to Lisa, they say it's a United flight. And then, a few seconds later, Kate said, they say it's flight 11. And I said to Lisa, they say it's flight 11. Now, Lisa is a travel agent. and she knew the flights, and she said to me, "No, there is no United Flight 11. You better go check your ticket." So I went upstairs to get my ticket, and I looked at it, and the original ticket, which I fortunately changed, was for September 11th, 2001. And needless to say, I sort of got down on my knees.
It was American Flight 11.
Yeah, it was American Flight 11. And I had originally made the reservation, and then actually when I said to Lisa, who was my travel agent, I said, you know, I don't really have to be out there on Tuesday. And she said, don't tell me about that. In order to change it, you have to go downtown, and you got to go to the American office. It's a big deal. Why don't you just go out there on Tuesday? And I said, okay, you know. And then a couple of days later, we had a guest staying with us who wanted to go see Filene's Basement downtown. And Lisa told me, are you sure? Came to me and said, are you sure you want to change this to Wednesday? And I said, yeah, it'd be better for me if we changed it to Wednesday. And she said, okay, well, I'm going to go down. I'm going to be down there anyway. I can go over to American and change it. So she did.
Yeah, but I remember calling you back because you didn't call me back. And I said, what are you doing? He goes, I'm on my knees praying, trying to figure out why I was saved.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that line.